Oh, hi. Can I interest any of you in some further discussion about the end of the world? Hey Internet, my name is Jeff and I'm a pastor, and today we are continuing our conversation with part 3 about the end of the world, or at least the texts that people typically turn to when they're trying to have a conversation about the end of the world, or trying to talk about how the Bible talks about the end of the world. And what we've been seeing so far in parts 1 and 2, first of all, watch parts 1 and 2, because, you know, helpful information, and also, you know, watch parts 1 and 2. And what we've found in parts 1 and 2 as we've looked at some of these texts is that the texts that people use to talk about the end of the world aren't necessarily talking about the end of the world. Instead, they're talking about a new beginning happening. In other words, they don't just have something to say to us in the future, like get ready for some sort of impending future end of the world. They have something to say to us in the present. And they call us to some sort of present action, or they're there to give us peace and comfort in the present with what we're going through here and now. So in the first video, we talked about the prophets in the Old Testament and this phrase they used, the day of the Lord, and how this is a phrase that calls us to present action, to participate in justice in the present, because justice is coming. So we need to make sure that we're on the side of justice here and now and working for justice here and now. And last week we talked about Revelation. Revelation is a really interesting book. It was written in the year 90 AD by a guy named John. John was a church leader, a pastor of sorts, and he was writing it in the year 90 to comfort the church in the year 90. So imagine, John is writing to this church that's struggling. They need comfort. They need some sort of sense of peace. They need a message from their pastor. Imagine if that message from John was, hey guys, everything is going to be great. In 1,931 years, it's just going to be awesome. See, that's what we make John say if we make the book of Revelation all about us and all about some sort of end of the world that's going to be happening next week or next month. Essentially, we say that this book has been useless for the last 1,931 years, and that the 22 chapters that John wrote in this letter to comfort his people, we make the message of those 22 chapters, hey, everything's going to be great in 2 millennia. So mark your calendars, right? It's a book that was written for them to give them some sort of peace and comfort. Does it give peace and comfort to us? Yes, absolutely it does. But first we have to put it in its proper context and see what its message was for the original audience, and then we can start to see what message it might have for us in the present. And for more on that, you should just watch the last video, because of course you should. Now, you might be saying to yourself, okay, Jeff, Book of Revelation was written for the people of the year 90. Maybe it's not necessarily about the end of the world. Well, what about the last couple of chapters about the Book of Revelation? Those seem to be pointing to the future. So what do you have to say about that, Mr. Smart Guy with your fancy tea montage at the beginning of your videos? Well, you're right. First of all, the book of Revelation does seem to talk about the end at the end of the book, conveniently. So let's talk about that, because yes, it does talk about the end. And yet, I think that its discussion about the end calls us to present action, present peace, present comfort, rather than the last couple of chapters of Revelation being this grand warning about how Jesus is coming back next week, so you better get ready. So let's look at those passages at the end of Revelation, and let's start with Revelation 21, beginning in verse 1. So John writes, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city," well, let's stop there for a second. You might say to yourself, aha, see, there it is. New heaven and a new earth because the first heaven and the first earth passed away. End of the world. It's right there in the book of Revelation. And yes, you are correct. But once again, what is it saying to us in the present? What's it calling us to in the present? That's an important thing to remember here. So then in verse 2, "And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." So let's stop there for a second. Typically, when we think about heaven, at least, in the 21st century in America, we think of it as a place that's up there that we go to eventually. But here at the end of Revelation, John seems to be talking about heaven as something that comes down to us. Again, it says, "And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God." In other words, heaven isn't something that's up there, out there eventually. It's something that's here, or at least it's going to be present. And then in verse 3, it just reiterates this all the more. "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mortals.'" Not mortals are among the home of God, but the home of God is among mortals. See, what the author of Revelation, what John is trying to say here, is that heaven is an earthly reality. Heaven is here. It's not on another plane. Heaven, the dwelling of God, is on this plane. And then towards the end of the chapter, in verse 22, you find this. "I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb." In other words, why do you need a temple? God's presence is here. The earth is the temple. And then in verse 24, more interesting things happen. "The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. People will bring into it the glory and honor of the nations." Okay, here's why this is so interesting. Whenever there's been talk about the nations in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, it tends to be a reference to people who are outside of the covenant with God. And yet here, at the end, you find that apparently the nations, the people outside of the covenant, are still present. See, we tend to think of the afterlife as, oh yeah, the people who are outside of the covenant or haven't accepted Jesus, or however you want to put that, yeah, they're in hell. But here at the end of Revelation, we find that apparently the people who are on the outside of the covenant are there. And you also find that the gates of heaven are porous. Did you notice that? In verse 25, its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. Apparently the gates of heaven are porous. Like, people are still coming and going, even in the end. And then we get to chapter 22, the last chapter in the book of Revelation. "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations." So we find a lot of talk about rivers, a lot of talk about trees, and a lot of talk about fruit. If you've read the Bible before, even if you've tried reading the Bible before, but you cut out after a few chapters, this should still sound familiar, because this is a reflection of what's in Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, right? Trees, rivers, water, fruit, all things that you find in the story of the beginning. So what you find is that the end actually sort of reflects the beginning. I'm going to teach you one of my very favorite Greek words. I love this word. It's the word apokatastasis. And this word means something like restoration or renewal. But the best definition that I've heard for it is the end will be like the beginning. So what we find in Revelation, even at the end, in the parts that are talking about the end, they're not necessarily talking about, and this is the end, period, it's over. They're saying, this is a new beginning. See, what we're finding in the Bible over and over again, even in these passages like Revelation that seem to be very clear that they're talking about the end, is that they are also an invitation to a new beginning here and now. So what's the message of the end of the book of Revelation? Well, it's an invitation to a new beginning here and now. Because heaven isn't going to be up there eventually. Heaven is on this plane, or is going to be on this plane. Heaven is more of a present reality than a future out there far away reality. The message also seems to be that, if the gates of heaven are going to be open eventually and they're porous and the nations are still coming and going, this should change the way that we think about the nations or talk about the nations or the people who are on the outside of the covenant. I hear people talk disparagingly about unbelievers all the time. Well, apparently, at least in the glimpse that we have into this future end reality, they're all part of it. This should change the way that we talk about unbelievers or people that we believe are outside of the covenant or outside of the promises of God. But I think the big thing here, just to say it again, again in this video, but also again because it's been the message of the other two videos, Revelation is way more about the invitation to a new beginning rather than a warning about the end. It's not trying to say Jesus is coming back, so you better get ready. It's trying to say there's a new beginning happening now and getting ready to happen more and more. Do you want to be a part of it? You can be a part of it, even here, even now. There is an invitation to a new beginning for you. All right, so that's the book of Revelation, and we have one more video in this series. We're going to talk about what Jesus says about the end. Hint, it's going to be more about a new beginning than it is about an end. But you shouldn't not watch the video just because you already kind of know what the message is going to be. You should still definitely watch that video, part 4. Anyway, click like and subscribe in this video. It helps a lot. Click the bell so that you'll be notified whenever I post a new video, like that awesome 4th video that you should definitely watch that's coming out real soon. And that is it for this time. I'll see you in the next video. Grace and peace, everybody.